I just want to first thank David Plank for all the work he's done to put this together and for all the work that he does for PACE. So I just wanted to give a shout out to David. Okay, so my task was to have us start thinking about what we mean by equity, thinking about the intent of the LCFF policy by way of equity, what we know about how this has been playing out, and then some thoughts about where we should go next. So Deborah Stone has this wonderful book called Policy Paradox, and I assign it to all of my students in my graduate student classes in policy. And she talks about equity as being the fair distribution of conditions and resources. And she talks about equity is the goal for all sides in a distributive conflict. The conflict comes over how the sides envision the distribution of what is at issue. And to help make her point, she tells the reader to imagine this delicious, bittersweet chocolate cake that she's going to bring into her policy class and trying to distribute it equitably. And she talks about some of the challenges that she encounters when she decides to divide it evenly to everyone in the class. So some of the students come in and they say, I'm hungry, I didn't eat lunch, I should get a larger piece. She talks about this humorous story of how the men's liberationists stage a protest in front of her class, saying that women have always had greater access to chocolate cake because they've been taught to bake, and boys have been told that they should be going outside and outdoors and playing football. And so men as a group should get an equal share, even though they make up a smaller portion of the class. She has her colleagues in political science, and they talk about how the cake should really be distributed according to the structure of their department. So undergraduates should get crumbs, graduate students should get a mouthful, associate professors, should get a wedge, and then, the full professor should get a wedge with extra icing on it. And then, of course, she talks about the economics majors in her class want no part of all of this, and they just think everyone should just be given a fork and they should just go at it. And in fact, I do the same thing in my class. I bring a cake, and I ask everybody to figure out and argue for how this should be divided. And you can imagine we get dozens and dozens of arguments of what would be a fair distribution of this cake. And so my point is that while we all agree, probably in this room, on that education policy and finance formulas should be advancing equity, how we actually define equity might mean very different things to each of us. So if we look at the literature, you can go to philosophy, political science, education finance, critical theory, right? There's many different ways of thinking about it. This is just one typology that I'm presenting here. A libertarian perspective might think about focusing more on fair competition so that we have a set of rules that everyone follows, and that if you're going to give additional resources, you have to justify that based on merit, right? So you could imagine that we would give more highly skilled teachers to gifted students, for example. That would fit into sort of a libertarian view. A liberal stance is looking more at social disadvantages and how we address and sort of level the playing field, so you would give more resources to those with greater needs. A democratic liberal perspective might be focused more on that individuals should be supported to achieve kind of universal thresholds and high standards, and that we would give more resources to those who are struggling to meet those standards, a big focus on outcomes. And then a transformative perspective really thinks about oppression and the effects of racism and classism, and would talk about resources more as promoting kind of the empowerment of students who have been harmed by these dynamics of power and privilege, right? That resources should be used to also address structural barriers and develop the strengths of marginalized students. And you can see these vary in terms of their emphasis more on some of the inputs versus outcomes, for example. Another way that we could think about equity would be, if you think about the school finance work and court decisions, there's a lot of talk about vertical and horizontal equity, right? Lots of this attention to trying to address the disparities between affluent and less affluent districts, for example. And horizontal equity thinks about providing the same resources for those with the same needs. So you could imagine the kind of per pupil funding, equal per pupil funding. And then a vertical conception of equity is going to push more on providing greater resources to those with more disadvantage or greater needs. So a weighted formula. And again, we could probably map on liberal and libertarian on all that onto these, right? That a libertarian view is very much focused on horizontal. A liberal view might combine both of those. So where does LCFF fit in all of this? If we think about the language of the policy and some of the statements made by the governor over time, and the structure of it, right? There's an emphasis on vertical equity and a little bit on the horizontal, right? So if you think about vertical equity, we're talking about supplemental and concentration funds going towards high needs kids, defined by low income, foster youth, English learner, homeless. And then horizontal equity, you might think about the base grants that are distributed also by size and grade level, but it's sort of equal for those at those levels. And if you think about, I'm sure we're all familiar with this quote that gets used a lot when Governor Brown at his State of the State in 2013, he said, "A child in a family making $20,000 a year or speaking a language different from English or living in a foster home requires more help. Equal treatment for children in unequal situations is not justice." Right, so the idea that fair treatment of students with greater academic needs requires additional resources, very much on the equity side. So you might map it here, right? You could think about what Governor Brown has said in terms of like needs-based distribution is very much a sort of liberal idea, but the idea of differentiating inputs to improve outcomes and closing gaps is very much a sort of democratic liberal kind of idea. Okay, so what do we know? How is this playing out? What more could be done? I'm just going to go quickly through some of the evidence, and I think there'll be others on the panel who are going to address some of this in more depth. Ryan knows this. Research Ed Trust West, Carrie Hannell, and his colleagues have put together a really nice report, and they looked at revenue over time, and this looks at the revenue gap per pupil funding between the highest poverty and the lowest poverty districts, so that's what these bars are. And if you look at the two funds on the left, that's before LCFF, right? So in 2008, the highest poverty districts received $150 less per pupil. In 2012, that gap had grown to $829 less per pupil. And then when we look after LCFF, 2015, the highest poverty districts received $334 more per pupil. Right, and they report, this is the most equitable they've seen district funding ever since these data have been available. So some promising evidence if we think about inputs and just in terms of revenue. In terms of outcomes, we don't have a real clear picture, although I think we might have a better picture after Sean does his presentation after me. But there's been some studies with very, I would say, limited studies in terms of our ability to attribute these outcomes to LCFF. Cal Matters did a study on the biggest districts with the most unduplicated kids, and they found that there were increases in achievement gaps. Michael Fullen and his colleagues have done some work where they talk about early signs of positive improvements in some of these outcomes. A lot of people think it's too early. I think we're going to see something more in a minute, so I will not steal his thunder. But what do we know about the actual programs and the services? Are students getting greater opportunities, particularly the higher needs? And again, we have mixed evidence here, so I'm going to draw on that Ed Trust West report again. They found, for example, student-to-staff ratios have improved when you look pre and post LCFF. But they also found some disparities. So they found that students in the highest poverty schools actually have significantly less access to certain personnel like counselors and librarians. They also found gaps in courses available to students in these schools. And I think a lot of people have had some trouble with the data, although maybe with the new proposed budget, there will be some greater transparency that can help us kind of get at some of these questions. So I want to talk about some of the implementation pieces of this. That's sort of where my work lies. I think if we want to understand how districts are using the money, we have to understand how they're interpreting the policy. And I think that the issue of ambiguity comes up a lot. So some organizations have claimed that districts aren't properly using and justifying their use of supplemental and concentration funds. So Public Advocates, I know, has a report that had shown very clearly that there's a lack of understanding around this notion that you're supposed to be using supplemental and concentration funds to principally direct it at the district's goals around high needs kids, and that those are supposed to be effective. And there's a sort of a lack of understanding about what that means. In the work that I've been doing with the Local Control Funding Formula Research Collaborative, we found some variation in interpretation. So the LCFF-RC is a group of folks including Julie Kopich, Jennifer O'Day, David Plank, Dan Humphrey, Laura Stokes, Magali Levidens. And we've been studying for the past couple of years districts and really going in and understanding deeply how they're making sense of the policy, how they're allocating resources. And last year we went into 8 school systems and we really looked deeply at what they were meaning by equity and then how they were allocating resources. And we saw some differences. I mean, we found that most districts really did view LCFF as a way of advancing vertical equity. So providing greater resources to students with greater needs. And you could see that in the way they allocated their funds. But there were some differences, and I'm going to show an example in a minute, but my point here is that differences in the way people are interpreting the equity mandate actually indicates that maybe the understanding at the state level of this goal isn't necessarily as clear as we might think. So let me give just a quick couple examples. So one district we went to, everyone we talked to, the LCAP, the planning documents, it was very clear that they had a vertical equity goal here. They were providing greater resources for students with greater needs. And it was really visible. You would see that they were moving more people into the schools with the high unduplicated, and that actually entailed cutting back on allocations to schools where there were fewer unduplicated kids. So very much consistent with the intent of the policy. This was the superintendent who said, here we talk about giving each student what they need, not an equal amount of money or service or dollar. Very consistent with some of the words that we've heard from the governor. Another district we went to, we found competing conceptions of equity. So some embraced this idea of providing greater resources for students with greater needs, but there were quite a few who were pushing more on horizontal equity, this idea that everyone should have equal resources. And that played out directly in the way they were allocating the funds. So while we could identify certain situations where they were putting funds towards schools with higher unduplicated kids, focusing on the high needs kids with summer transition programs, for example, a large portion of their LCFF dollars were going to all schools, whether that was professional development for all teachers, whether that was personnel and coaches in all schools, or paying for the administrative fees for student testing for all students. And this was a principal who was explaining to us, LCFF seems like reverse equity because some schools are not Title I. And when people think of equity, they think of the underserved. Our students, this was a Title I, but they had sort of a mid-range unduplicated kids, are just as in need as the students in the high unduplicated schools. So we heard this idea of reverse equity quite a bit in this district, which may not fully align with some of people's conceptions of what LCFF is about, right? And we're looking more at these data right now, but the districts that we, I guess my point is that when districts think about equity, that greatly shapes the way that they're actually choosing to allocate the resources. And of course there are other factors in politics involved in the decision making, but this idea of interpretation I think is an important one to keep in mind. Okay, I know I'm probably running out of time. Another piece of the implementation story that's super important is stakeholder engagement. There's an assumption here that local stakeholders understand the goals, they've been part of developing them, and then they were going to review progress of the district's ability to meet those goals and advance equity over time. But our research and the research of a lot of people show that districts are really struggling with this component of the policy. There are struggles around attendance and response rates and getting people to participate. There is some sense of if they are involved, they're maybe just receiving information and it's not deep engagement. There's concerns about the loudest voices are being heard and they don't necessarily represent all of the stakeholders or those who aren't present or those who are the sort of quieter voices. We have indications from the poll, year after year in our poll, that there's very low levels of public awareness of LCFF that could be contributing, and then also evidence that there's limited capacity, right? So that districts and communities just might not have the staff, the knowledge, the sort of resources to actually engage. So I think all of this raises questions about whether stakeholders really can hold districts accountable for achieving the equity goals and advancing equity as envisioned by the policy. And then my final piece of the puzzle around that I think we need to keep in mind are that there's a set of resource constraints that existed before LCFF and are still not addressed by LCFF. Over and over in our research and the research of others, we hear about, yes, funding has gone up, but we still are facing rising costs related to personnel and special ed, and there is not adequate funding. And in fact, the 2 districts that I had called out, those differences, the district that was able to consistently redistribute resources also consistently told us that there was a foundation of adequate funding that allowed them to do that. And then in the district that I was talking about with reverse equity, they kept talking about the lack of adequate funding as the rationale for why they felt they had to spread resources evenly and help out even the non-Title I schools. And this is a quote from one of those administrators who said, "School adequacy. I think that really is the elephant in the room. There lacks adequacy to fulfill all of our obligations." Okay, so what's next? There's support for this policy, and it's consistent, and it's been, this is from our recent poll. Morgan's going to share more about it. We ask every year, we describe the policy in the gray box, and then we ask people to what extent they favor or oppose it. And you can see year after year, in 2015, 57% were strongly or somewhat supportive of the LCFF policy. It went up to 71% the next year. This is a year and a half later, just the other week, we see still 2/3 of the public supports the idea of LCFF. And again, spelling out very clearly here, equity goals. But there's some pressure here for some change, right? So we're all aware of the concern around lack of transparency. I think that could be addressed by some of the changes that are proposed. There also have been another issue that's come up in the districts that we've studied, which is raising the question around the colorblind nature of this policy, right? So need is defined not by race or ethnicity, by EL, income, foster youth, homeless. But some people really did wonder why they couldn't use their supplemental and concentration funds to address need identified around racial and ethnic subgroups. And I'm going to give this example. This is a central office administrator who said, in a district like ours, where it's 79% of our students being Hispanic, identifying them as a specific group to serve is really important. And yet if I write and say that Hispanic students go to college at a much lower rate than white or Asian students, there's a gap in performance. Technically, that wouldn't necessarily be an approvable expenditure for our county, right? For the supplemental and concentration funds. And her point was that not all Hispanic students in her district are English learners or low income. And yet she couldn't use her resources for the supplemental concentration. And I've been to other districts that have talked about disproportionate suspension rates for African American students, wanting to target something specifically for those students, and yet they felt they couldn't use the supplemental and concentration funds for that. Now, it's not clear, I'm not a legal expert, whether that would even be feasible, and whether politically that's feasible, or whether the public supports it. And I don't have time to do this, but in our poll, my colleague David Quinn has been looking at public attitudes towards reforms that are targeting closing the gap defined by income and wealth versus closing the gap defined by race and ethnicity. And the public nationally, and our poll seems to suggest that there's more support for defining the gap around income versus race and ethnicity, which suggests that a race-conscious approach might be politically difficult as well. I've just put that out there. I feel that transformative notion of equity pushes on a race-conscious definition of equity. And that idea has come up in some of our districts that we've been to, and it's not talked about. So I just wanted to raise it. Okay, finally, what more could we do? I want to make a recommendation that we all probably agree with, that we've all been hearing, is that we need to focus on adequacy and the rising costs that districts are facing now and are going to continue to face around pensions and special ed and all of those costs in the future. I think we need to clarify the equity goals. The varying interpretations and the lack of understanding that we're hearing suggest that more is needed. I think that maybe a race-conscious approach isn't feasible or desirable, but is there ways to create some more flexibility to define need at a local level beyond the categories that we have? I throw that out there. And then the final thing is around capacity. I think that if we want this community to be involved in helping to push and advance the equity goals here, we need to work on broadening representation and deepening involvement from particularly underrepresented individuals and families that are representing the target kids. We can do that with outreach, we could do that with training. There's a lot that could be done, and maybe with the additional funds that CCEE and counties might be getting, maybe that could be an area of work that we could focus on. So those are my thoughts. Thank you very much.